In Lives of Women's History Month, I want to talk about women's hidden role in education history. So, did you know some of the most remarkable contributions to education throughout history were made by women, but they were hidden and erased from historical context? So, let's talk about some fascinating yet often overlooked stories that may change the way that you see the history of education. So, I'm going to start with what I would deem to be one of the most horrific and tragic erasures of women's knowledge and contributions to education, and I'm going to start with childbirth itself, because it's one of those things that has always been obviously biologically something that happens to women, and it was something that already has a lot of deep and heavy tragic history behind it in the way that women were treated and are continued to be seen and treated due to their reproductive system. This is a very horrible realization, because I never knew this myself until I read a really good book called Unwell Women, and it completely blew my mind, and it now makes a lot of sense for modern day perceptions and modern day care. I think once you learn about this, it's kind of like it gets worse, basically, because I feel like once you remove women's contributions and knowledge in childbirth from history, the more it's easier to condition people to believe anything, because this is something that solely belonged to women, and it is something that only women have ever been able to do. So for centuries, midwives were the only ones delivering babies and offering gentle hands-on care, and also staying with the mothers after the delivery of the baby, and building that connection throughout postpartum. And if you couldn't guess already where this story is going, male physicians took over. They dismissed midwives as uneducated and often labelled them as witches. I'm going to try my hardest not to laugh through this, because every time I think about the history of just women, there's always some unhinged story from men, and I'm just like, why? To stop. And the result of that was maternal deaths did double in some areas, infant mortality climbed due to forceful unsanitary interventions, and postpartum care, which midwives actually prioritised, was horribly neglected. The male-dominated medical field introduced barbaric practices, and I don't know if anyone can see the parallels and patterns in when men enter spaces and are very aggressive. The patriarchy itself, you could argue, is basically that is what it is. And I find it crazy how something as natural and unique to women was completely taken over by men. And some of the barbaric practices that they introduced were things like forceps, which ended up being overused as well. We still use forceps, which proper goes through me, but it was used in a way that was very forceful. There was no regard of the mother's health, let alone the baby's health. And of course, they were unsanitary for a long while. And also, they didn't use anesthesia for it. So you can just imagine how much pain a lot of these women were going through. And it's just the fact that there was no care for how the mother may feel. And another barbaric practice that has completely burned into my brain, and I will never forget this, was male doctors would drug women during labour and leave them in disoriented states. And the sad truth is when men invaded childbirth, women and babies paid the price, and it's a price we're still paying today through the medicalisation of birth and also the lack of postpartum care. Now, I swear it was like my dad who said this to me like years and years and years ago. I really don't remember who said it, and I really do think it was my dad. So here's a food for thought, because this has stuck with me for a very, very long time. Childbirth is probably the first medical practice that humans had the most knowledge about. Like, whenever we kind of evolved, it just makes sense that when we were able to start understanding things and we became a lot more conscious and sentient, why wouldn't it be the first thing humans started to understand first? Before we even knew how to set broken bones, before we started to understand fevers, simple things like colds, and before we started to understand simple mere flesh wounds, before all of that, these little things you would probably get living in survival mode in the wilderness and with crazy animals that may no longer exist today, it makes sense because we had to reproduce. So when we talk about the first medical practice that we did have the most knowledge in, childbirth probably was it. Women were already understanding how to treat women in labour and postpartum as well. Like, that connection was like the most primal thing I can think of. It's one of the most natural things that we started to understand and become educated on. So for years later, we were able to share that knowledge and teach other people and teach each other how to care for a labouring woman and also a baby and a mother in postpartum. Of course, it would have been a very tragic, brutal evolution of it, because obviously women were and have died and still are dying in childbirth, but it's obviously on a completely different scale back then. But to understand women's health and something so extraordinary as childbirth it takes a lot. It takes a lot to understand it, and it takes a lot to be able to share it amongst each other and keep that connection. So I would say midwives and just women in general were probably the first real medical practitioners. It's so insane to think about that, because it just makes sense. In fact, the oldest known medical text ever found is specifically about childbirth and women's health. It's wild to think that something that was once seen as a sacred and communal event and brought together connections and community and empathy and understanding was then taken over and dominated by male physicians, and it then erased the wisdom that women carried and passed on for millennia. I find that just so abhorrent, and it's so sad, because why is it as soon as these men were invading women's knowledge and education that they decided to erase women and their contributions and be like, we're taking credit, we're going to say this is this, and we're going to be the pioneers of something like childbirth? It's the fact that midwives were basically ostracized and shunned out of their profession and were completely insulted. How do you literally look at midwives and women carrying knowledge about something as sacred and communal as childbirth and just ridicule them for it and push them out the profession and label them as witches and people practicing inadequate things and they don't know what's best and blah, blah, blah. And it's like the fact that they went to town on it and were really like, we're going to put you down and make the rest of society to believe that you are not as good as male doctors. And it's just so sad, because childbirth was one of the first things that we ever documented and ever fully understood. Obviously, to the degree of education they did have and the knowledge and the tools they had. It's not the only thing in history that obviously men have erased about women, and societies continue to function off it. It's just like, why can't you just leave things? Why did you have to come for something like childbirth? Why? It's just crazy. So now I want to talk about the Middle Ages, which is a time that was widely assumed that only monks created illuminated manuscripts. But in 2019, archaeologists made a surprising discovery: the skeleton of a woman from around 1000 AD who had traces of lapis lazuli in her teeth. And what was so significant about this discovery was that lapis lazuli was a rare and expensive blue pigment used for manuscript illustrations. So this meant she was most likely a scribe, licking her pen while working, something male scribes also did. But here's the kicker: historians have only ever credited the creation of these intricate illuminated texts to men. So this woman's teeth kind of indicates that women were quietly preserving and producing knowledge, even though their contributions were erased in history. And it kind of just makes me laugh how over time we keep finding small, very small, but massively distinctive discoveries about women, and they're just in their graves, just kind of like, I'm going to keep you on your toes. Why are we only crediting things to men? They aren't the only ones, and if anything, you've got to wonder why we erased women from history in the first place. And it just makes me laugh because this woman's teeth were just intact this whole time with this blue pigment in her teeth. And then now archaeologists and historians are like, maybe we got this wrong. Maybe women really did do things. And it's kind of sad because obviously we won't fully know the number of women that really did produce a lot of knowledge, especially in the Middle Ages. And it makes you wonder, were men just kind of erasing women from that as well? Like, were they really that envious and probably jealous of how creative and amazing women really were with their knowledge. It's really interesting to see, and it's kind of like something that I know for a fact I won't miss out on when I'm teaching a lot of historical context to my daughter. I'm going to always make sure to back up things to be like, we've learned about it this way, now let's see if there was any women behind a lot of this. And I mean, I'm kind of loving it for women right now, because the amount of crap that men run with, like, women didn't do this, women didn't do that. And it's like, this woman's teeth is just like, hey, her gnashes are literally just like, I can prove you guys wrong tenfold. It just makes me laugh, because I'm just like, it took this woman's teeth just to be like, hey. Now, here's a really interesting one. In 19th century Britain, despite having fewer education opportunities, working class women were usually more literate than the men. The reason being is because domestic service often required women to be able to read and write. So it'll be things like bookkeeping, letter writing, and of course, managing the household tasks. Whereas men who were in manual labour jobs had less need for literacy. So in certain areas, women were actually outperforming men in things like reading comprehension, even though they had fewer rights and literally no access to formal education. Like, can you imagine being more skilled but having less opportunities just because of your gender? Like, there was no other reason but your gender. Why? And how did, like, mostly men believe this? Because I can guarantee you a lot of girls and women were just like, yeah, so this is kind of like unhinged behavior. A lot of girls and women were just sat there like, it's embarrassing, like, because it is embarrassing looking back and being like, okay, so we obviously have like a lot of research and evidence that girls and women were outperforming boys and men academically, but somehow they weren't allowed to step foot in things like universities or just higher education, and also have good, powerful positions in society, because apparently their brains just can't function the same as a man's, even though they're outperforming them in things as basic as literacy. So now let's scoot back to ancient Egypt, one of my most favourite eras in history. Women weren't only literate, but they also held very prestigious educational roles. One of the earliest known female physicians was Peseshet, and she lived around 2600 BC. She was described as the lady overseer of female physicians. How amazing does that sound? It's such a good title. I love that for her. And it basically means she was most likely training and educating other women in medicine. And on top of that, some wealthy Egyptian women were also scribes, a profession that required advanced literacy. Imagine being a woman with both literacy and medical expertise thousands of years ago, just for your legacy to be buried by history. And we cannot forget about indigenous cultures, where women were often the primary educators and knowledge keepers. In Iroquois and First Nation communities, women passed on essential knowledge for things like agriculture techniques, medicine, and oral histories, all through storytelling. Their educational roles weren't formal in the Western sense, but they were vital at preserving culture and language. And yet these contributions are rarely recognised in mainstream education narratives. So these are just a few examples of the many ways that women helped to shape education throughout history, often quietly and of course against the odds. And yet their contributions were often ignored, erased, or wrongly attributed to men. And it's really interesting because the theme in all of these stories that I've told you all have a theme of women sharing stories and communicating with one another and connecting with one another, and peacefully doing so. It was always just women sharing amongst their communities, and especially amongst each other. When you start learning these stories of women sharing stories and knowledge and passing on education to one another, I've now learnt these things, and now I can pass this on to my daughter. I can pass this knowledge and education on to my daughter to say, hey, look, women were really severely conned and discredited. And it's like, you can pass this knowledge on. The one thing that men kept doing and succeeding every now and then was stopping women from sharing their knowledge, sharing their stories, because they knew the real power of connection and the connection within communities. They just knew sharing knowledge was so powerful. And usually when women shared knowledge, it was raw, it was real, and it was connecting people. And I feel like if you want to look at it from a patriarchal perspective and lens, that is not good in a patriarchal system. Every time men wanted power and continued to uphold toxic power, sharing stories through communities and connection was the worst threat It was a threat to patriarchal societies and norms. And it's not always just due to the fact that we just didn't discover some of these stories and things. There were things that people would have definitely known from the times that it was happening. It just never got accredited. It was never passed on properly. And I think because most of these women were living peacefully and quietly, it never erupted into being known. And I think it's just a weird pattern and theme that every time women held these spaces and shared stories and connection and communities, men invaded them. They invaded them and then just like completely had so much entitlement and were just like, no, we know better. And it's like one of the biggest cons we've had throughout history, and we still have a lot of people upholding this narrative. And it's weird because I also think it's quite beautiful that, I've learned these things myself and now I'm sharing them in a video and storytelling. I'm passing on this knowledge and these stories. And it's like, not only am I sharing them in a video, I'm also going to pass them on to my daughter. And all of these stories could have skipped a generation. I could have just never known these stories and carried on and had a daughter and never passed them on. But it's like, it's found its way. It's found its way. And it's found its way to be passed on. And these stories of all these incredible women are being known. And we just can't deny the fact that women really did contribute a lot to society. And the way they were contributing to their societies was so much more peaceful and so much more kind and connected than what men and the patriarchal norms and societies were giving people. Women were creating these communities and connections amongst themselves, and it wasn't leaving people behind. There wasn't like a hierarchy of it. They weren't going, I'm better than you, this and that. It was like sharing stories respectfully, compassionately and empathetically to build knowledge, to build each other up and to build societies and villages together. But men just couldn't do that. Men just could not, for the sake of them, just be calm and just exist peacefully. So next time we think about history, women were there, writing, preserving and teaching knowledge, even when history tried to erase them. If you found this eye-opening, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it and also drop a comment letting me know which story you found most surprising. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel if you would like to see more content like this from me.